My parents spent thousands of dollars showering my sister's children with extravagant gifts on New Year's Eve, while my son received nothing more than a cheap plastic toy that looked like it had been picked up at a gas station checkout counter. When my father later told me that the family would be better off without me and my defective child, I walked away without raising my voice, without arguing, and without shedding a single tear. 2 weeks later, that same father called me in desperation, begging for $15,000 to rescue the lavish lifestyle he could no longer afford. My response was only one sentence long, but it left him speechless and shattered the illusion he had spent years building around himself. Before I continue, tell me where you're watching from in the comments below, and if you've ever had to stand up to toxic relatives who underestimated your value, don't forget to like and subscribe. My name is Chelsea. I'm 34 years old and live in Chicago, where I built my career from the ground up. Today, I'm the founder and CEO of a highly respected forensic accounting and data analytics firm. My entire profession revolves around uncovering truths that others desperately try to hide. I trace offshore accounts, expose corporate fraud, uncover embezzlement schemes, and reveal the financial realities hidden beneath carefully crafted appearances. Yet to my family, none of that mattered. To them, I was simply the daughter who had disappointed everyone. When I became a single mother at 23, they threw me out of the house, convinced I had destroyed their carefully maintained suburban image. They treated me as though I were a stain on the family name rather than a young woman fighting to build a future for herself and her child. Over the next decade, I built a successful company from absolutely nothing. I worked 80-hour weeks, sacrificed sleep, skipped vacations, and poured every ounce of energy into creating a stable and loving life for my son. Throughout all those years, my family never once took the time to understand what I actually did for a living. That ignorance would eventually become the most costly mistake they ever made. The breaking point arrived on New Year's Eve at my parents' enormous home in one of Chicago's wealthiest suburbs. The house looked like a monument to artificial prosperity. Every hallway was draped with expensive pine garlands, every room overflowing with decorations designed to impress guests and neighbors alike. Everything sparkled with wealth, or at least, the appearance of it. I brought my 7-year-old son Leo, hoping the evening might remain relatively peaceful. Leo is an incredibly bright and kind-hearted child who happens to have mild ADHD. Loud environments can overwhelm him, and chaotic situations often make him anxious, but he is thoughtful, gentle, and always tries his best to make everyone around him happy. That evening, he sat quietly in the corner of the massive living room, his small hands folded neatly in his lap. He wasn't causing trouble. He wasn't demanding attention. He was simply trying to stay out of the way, while the loud celebration unfolded around him. The floor was covered in mountains of torn wrapping paper and shiny ribbons. At the center of all the excitement stood my younger sister Brittany and her husband Donovan, cheering loudly as their 2 children opened gift after gift. Donovan, a tall and imposing man who never appeared in public without a custom-tailored suit, loved presenting himself as a wildly successful venture capitalist. He spoke constantly about investments, startups, and market opportunities, as though he were delivering financial wisdom to the masses. Nearby, my parents, Richard and Susan, stood proudly by the fireplace, smiling with obvious admiration toward Brittany's family while barely acknowledging Leo's presence. They had spared no expense on their favorite grandchildren. I watched as Brittany's children opened what looked like a luxury showroom disguised as Christmas gifts. There were 2 brand-new iPad Pros, designer winter coats from Gucci Kids, premium electronics, expensive toys. Then came the grand finale, a miniature ride-on Tesla that drove directly across the living room floor while everyone applauded. I quickly estimated the total value, at least $2,500 spent on 2 children in a single evening. Then my mother finally approached Leo. She handed him a tiny package wrapped in thin paper. It was so light that I immediately knew there was nothing significant inside. Leo smiled politely and thanked her before carefully opening the gift. Inside was a flimsy plastic toy car. It looked exactly like something found in a dusty clearance bin beside a gas station register. A faded yellow sticker still clung to the bottom, revealing its original price, $10. Leo didn't complain. He didn't look disappointed. He simply rolled the little car across the hardwood floor and smiled. But the contrast in that room was impossible to ignore. The difference between how my son was treated and how Brittany's children were treated was so obvious it felt almost cruel. I looked at my mother, silently waiting for an explanation. Instead, Brittany approached with a crystal champagne glass in hand and a familiar smirk on her face. "You know, Chelsea," she said sweetly, using the fake kindness she always adopted before saying something vicious. "Private school children really need advanced technology these days. My kids are learning coding and digital design. The iPads are practically educational necessities." I remained silent. Brittany took another sip and continued. "We told Mom and Dad not to spend too much on Leo. With his condition, it's not like he can focus on anything for very long anyway. Expensive electronics would just be wasted on him. He'd probably break them during one of his episodes." The words hit like ice. A simple toy is more appropriate for a child with his limitations. Before I could respond, my mother nodded in agreement. "Brittany has a point," she said while smoothing her expensive cashmere sweater. "You have to be realistic, Chelsea. We didn't want to buy him something valuable only to see it ruined. Besides, Brittany and Donovan are doing exceptionally well. Their children are accustomed to a different standard of living." A different standard of living. That was how she justified it. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply stood there and observed. Years of professional experience had trained me to recognize inconsistencies, hidden truths, and financial deception. My father stood by the fireplace pretending to be a successful patriarch, yet I noticed the nervous perspiration beneath his collar. Donovan projected confidence, but I saw the subtle fraying on his shirt cuffs and the way he compulsively checked his phone every few minutes. The warning signs were everywhere. My mind automatically began connecting the dots. They believed they were humiliating the daughter who had disgraced the family. What they didn't realize was that I possessed the skills to dismantle every illusion they had built. I glanced down at Leo and silently promised myself that I would not engage in their games. I would let the truth do the work for me. A few minutes later, Donovan stepped into the center of the room with a glass of expensive whiskey in his hand. The ice clinked loudly as he adjusted his jacket, deliberately exposing the gold watch on his wrist. It was supposed to be a Rolex Daytona. To everyone else, it symbolized wealth and success. To me, it symbolized something entirely different. Years of investigating luxury asset fraud had taught me how to spot counterfeits. The watch was impressive, but not authentic. The details were wrong. The finishing was slightly off. The flaws were subtle, but unmistakable. My parents, however, saw only prestige. Donovan leaned casually against the marble fireplace and looked at me with open condescension. "You know, Chelsea," he announced loudly enough for the entire room to hear, "I saw you arrive in that old SUV of yours. Honestly, I'm surprised it made it up the driveway without falling apart." Several relatives laughed. "You should really let me manage some investments for you. A few aggressive crypto positions and you could finally upgrade to something modern. My children can't even imagine riding in a vehicle without heated leather seats and a panoramic roof." He smiled confidently. "It's all about building generational wealth. You have to spend money to make money. That's a mindset you still haven't figured out." My father nodded enthusiastically. My mother practically glowed with pride. To them, Donovan represented success itself, but my company specialized in exposing people exactly like him. Fraudsters, Manipulators, people who financed luxurious lifestyles with borrowed money and carefully constructed lies. As I listened to him speak, I realized something important. Donovan matched the profile of a professional scam artist almost perfectly, right down to the smallest behavioral details. And the deeper I looked, the more certain I became that the entire empire my family admired was built on a foundation far weaker than anyone realized. I rose slowly from the armchair, smoothing imaginary creases from my simple, unbranded black dress. Every movement was deliberate, controlled. I lifted my chin and met his gaze head-on, refusing to look away or reveal even the slightest hint of discomfort. If Donovan expected intimidation, he was about to be disappointed. "That's an incredibly generous offer of financial wisdom, Donovan," I said, my tone calm, polished, and sharp enough to cut through the room like a newly honed blade. "Although I have to admit, I'm a little confused by your investment philosophy. If your venture capital firm is producing such extraordinary, unstoppable generational wealth, why were you texting me late last month, asking for a discreet, undocumented loan of $5,000 to cover what you described as an urgent business crisis?" The effect was immediate. The living room fell into a silence so complete it felt almost unnatural. Even the soft holiday music drifting through the house suddenly seemed deafening. Donovan's smug, self-satisfied smile evaporated in an instant. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously, and shot a panicked glance toward my sister. Brittany gasped. Her face flushed a deep, uneven crimson as she stared at her husband, silently demanding an explanation he clearly did not have. Donovan opened his mouth, scrambling for words, trying desperately to construct a believable lie before the truth settled over the room. Instead, only an awkward stutter escaped. For the first time all evening, he looked exactly what he was: unprepared, exposed, and completely vulnerable before the audience he had spent hours trying to impress. Before he could recover, my father exploded. Richard slammed his crystal tumbler onto the mantelpiece with such force I genuinely thought it would shatter. The sharp crack echoed through the room. His face twisted into a terrifying expression of pure fury. Thick veins stood out along his neck as he stormed across the hardwood floor and positioned himself directly between me and his treasured son-in-law. "How dare you speak to him like that in my house?" he thundered. His voice rattled the decorative ornaments hanging from the walls. "You come here on a holiday and try to humiliate the only successful, respectable man your sister has ever brought into this family. You have absolutely no right to be jealous of the incredible life they've built together." He jabbed a trembling finger toward my face and stepped so close I could smell the expensive bourbon lingering on his breath. "Let's make one thing crystal clear, Chelsea," he spat. 11 years ago, you got pregnant out of wedlock and brought shame to this entire family. You dragged our respected name through the mud with your reckless decisions. We had to face our friends at the country club while you sat around acting like the victim." His expression darkened further. "And look at you now. You're still a struggling single mother driving a worthless car, bitter because you threw your life away before it even had a chance to begin." He turned dramatically and gestured toward Donovan, who was already regaining his confidence behind my father's protective presence. "Donovan is a real investor," Richard continued loudly. "He works with serious capital. He brings class, dignity, and prestige to this family. He understands how to build a future. Something you clearly know nothing about." Then he crossed the final line. The unforgivable one. His eyes shifted downward toward Leo. My sweet, quiet son had stopped playing with his toy car. He was sitting rigidly still, his small hands pressed tightly over his ears as the shouting echoed around him. His shoulders trembled with fear. My father looked at him and sneered. "Keep your distance from Brittany's children," he said coldly. "I won't have your toxic attitude poisoning this celebration." Then his gaze hardened even further. "In fact, This house is better off without you and your defective child dragging everyone down. Neither of you belong here." The words hung in the air like poison. The room seemed to shrink around us. Another daughter might have broken apart right there on the expensive Persian rug. Another woman might have cried, screamed, or pleaded for the affection that had always been withheld from her. I did none of those things. Instead, an extraordinary calm settled over me. It was the kind of peace that arrives when there is nothing left to lose. The kind that comes when a person finally understands that a bridge hasn't merely been burned, it has been reduced to ashes beyond recognition. I refused to waste another breath arguing with a man trapped inside his own carefully manufactured version of reality. Without responding, I turned away from Richard and walked toward my son. Leo had squeezed his eyes shut. His small body seemed to be folding into itself beneath the weight of the shouting. I knelt beside him, my dress brushing softly against the floor, and gently placed my hands over his. When he opened his eyes, I smiled. Not for anyone else in that room. Just for him. A warm, reassuring smile that shut out every ounce of cruelty surrounding us. "It's time to go, sweetheart," I whispered. My voice remained steady, free of anger or panic. "We're going to get hot chocolate and head home." I helped him stand and retrieved his navy winter coat from a nearby chair. Carefully, I guided his arms into the sleeves and buttoned it up one button at a time, making sure he was warm and comfortable. Behind me, the silence felt heavy. Their dramatic confrontation had failed to produce the emotional collapse they wanted. They had expected tears. They had expected humiliation. Instead, they were watching me leave with my dignity intact. By refusing to play the victim in their twisted family performance, I was quietly taking away their power. My mind had already shifted into analysis mode, cataloging weaknesses and inconsistencies the same way I approached corporate fraud investigations. As I took Leo's hand and headed toward the grand entryway, my mother finally intervened. Susan could never tolerate a scene ending without her having the last word. Her designer heels clicked sharply against the hardwood as she hurried after me. She adjusted her diamond necklace as though preparing for a magazine photo shoot rather than a family confrontation. She stepped directly into my path. "You go right ahead and walk out that door, Chelsea," she sneered. "But understand something. You made your choices 11 years ago, and now you get to live with them." Her perfectly manicured finger pointed toward my chest. "Don't think you can come crawling back when your little life gets too difficult. And don't even consider showing up next year asking for money. We have our own lives to maintain. We are finished financing your endless mistakes." I stopped with my hand hovering inches above the brass door handle. The irony was almost beautiful. She was lecturing me about begging for money while remaining completely unaware of the financial disaster already racing toward her husband. Slowly, I turned around. Richard stood proudly in the center of the room, chest puffed out like a victorious king. Donovan smirked behind him, while Brittany folded her arms in triumph, basking in what they believed was my defeat. I looked directly at my father. Then I let the silence stretch. 1 second, 2, 3, 4, 5. Long enough for discomfort to settle in. Long enough to watch the confidence in his eyes flicker. I wanted to remember that exact expression. Because when the time came, I intended to collect every debt. "Keep your pride, Richard," I said. My voice echoed through the foyer with the calm finality of a judge delivering a verdict. "Hold on to every bit of that arrogance. In exactly 2 weeks, you're going to need it when the bills come due." The smirk disappeared instantly. His entire body stiffened. For the briefest moment, the mask slipped. Beneath it, I saw fear. Raw, instinctive fear. The fear of a man who secretly knew his finances were collapsing and who suddenly realized someone else might know it too. He inhaled sharply. His eyes darted as he tried to decipher my meaning. But his ego won the battle. It always did. Straightening his shoulders, he scoffed loudly. "Get the hell out of my house." The words were aggressive, but the authority behind them had weakened. I didn't give him another glance. I opened the heavy mahogany door and stepped into the freezing winter night of the Chicago suburbs. The cold air felt remarkably clean after the suffocating toxicity I had left behind. Holding Leo's hand, I walked down the sweeping driveway away from the estate that had always felt more like a prison than a home. Throughout the evening, Donovan had mocked my supposedly worthless vehicle. What none of them understood was that I never drove my personal car to family gatherings. I had no intention of allowing them to estimate my actual financial position. Waiting at the end of the driveway was not an old truck. It was a pristine, custom-built black luxury SUV with deeply tinted windows. A vehicle worth more than Donovan's entire fabricated investment portfolio. A quiet symbol of genuine success. I opened the rear door and helped Leo climb inside, securing him safely in his leather seat. The cabin was warm, silent, and completely insulated from the chaos outside. After closing his door, I paused and exhaled slowly. A cloud of white mist drifted into the cold night. The simple act of shutting that door felt symbolic, as though I had finally closed the last chapter of my childhood. Walking around to the driver's seat, I took one final look at the brightly illuminated mansion. Through the large windows, I could see them returning to their champagne, their laughter, and their carefully rehearsed illusion that everything was perfect. They had no idea the foundation beneath their comfortable lives was already cracking. No idea the countdown had begun. I slid behind the wheel, started the engine, and listened to its smooth, powerful hum. Then I drove away into the darkness, leaving them behind to enjoy their final days of blissful ignorance, fully aware of what awaited them when the calendar finally turned and reality arrived to collect its debt. 2 weeks passed in the blink of an eye, slipping away so quickly it almost felt like they had never existed at all. The bitter cold of the Chicago winter battered relentlessly against the reinforced glass windows of my corner office on the 40th floor, as if the city itself were trying to break through. Yet inside, everything remained perfectly controlled, perfectly insulated from the chaos outside. My workspace stood as a quiet monument to the empire I had built from absolute scratch. Polished steel, dark mahogany surfaces, and wall-to-wall monitors streaming the intricate financial data of our corporate clients in real time. Vanguard Forensic Accounting was not merely a successful firm. We were the silent executioners of the financial district, the ones major banks discreetly hired when they needed hidden assets uncovered, and the carefully constructed lives of white-collar criminals dismantled piece by piece. There was no noise in our work, only precision, pressure, and inevitable collapse. I sat comfortably in my high-back leather chair, a steaming cup of black coffee resting in my hand, as I reviewed the latest batch of margin call reports. Life had a strange, almost ironic piece to it when you removed the poison from your daily routine, when everything unnecessary, emotional, or distracting was stripped away. I was just about to approve a forensic audit when the private line on my mahogany desk began to ring. It was a restricted number, one I only ever gave to high-level clients and elite legal counsel. My eyes drifted to the caller ID screen, and a cold, sharp smile slowly formed at the corner of my lips. Richard. My father. The timing was almost too perfect. I had expected this call. In fact, I had anticipated it down to the hour, like a calculated inevitability rather than a surprise. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee and allowed the phone to ring 3 full times, not out of hesitation, but to establish control over the moment before finally reaching forward and pressing the speaker button. The soft green light activated, filling my expansive office with a heavy, expectant silence that seemed to stretch across the entire room. "Chelsea, are you there, sweetheart?" The voice that came through the high-definition speaker was so jarringly unfamiliar that, for a fraction of a second, I almost didn't recognize it. It wasn't the booming, aggressive roar of the man who had once screamed at my terrified 7-year-old son on New Year's Eve. It wasn't the arrogant, condescending tone of the suburban patriarch who had declared I was a disgraceful failure, unworthy of his pristine household. No, this voice was different, sickeningly sweet, carefully softened, dripping with a manufactured affection so artificial it made my stomach turn with quiet disgust. It was the voice of a drowning man pretending he was still standing on solid ground. "I am here, Richard," I replied evenly, my tone perfectly level, stripped of warmth, recognition, or anything that might suggest familiarity. "Oh, wonderful. It's so good to hear your voice, my beautiful daughter," he continued quickly, forcing a hearty, almost theatrical chuckle into the line. The sound echoed hollowly through the speaker, fragile and strained beneath its own performance. "I know it's been a while since the holidays, and I just wanted to check in on you. How are you doing, my favorite girl? And how is my little grandson, Leo? I hope he's enjoying the new year so far." The sheer audacity of it was almost impressive. He was speaking as though nothing had happened, as though the catastrophic explosion in his own living room had never occurred, as though he had not loomed over my child, called him defective, and ordered us out of his house like we were nothing more than unwanted guests. It was classic revisionist denial, the kind that rewrote reality in real time to preserve fragile ego and avoid accountability. "We are doing exactly as well as we were 2 weeks ago," I said coldly, not offering him even a single inch of emotional ground. "State your business, Richard. I have a company to run, and my time is billed at a very high premium." There was a long, uncomfortable pause on the other end. I could almost picture him standing in his expensive suburban kitchen, loosening his silk tie, suddenly aware that his usual charm, his practiced dominance, wasn't working. That realization alone must have been unsettling. When he finally spoke again, the warmth had thinned, replaced by something more brittle, something closer to panic. "Well, Chelsea," he began carefully, his tone dropping into a forced casualness. "The truth is, I'm calling because we're dealing with a slight family situation." A faint smile tugged at my expression as I leaned back slightly in my chair. My father murmured on, I thought, almost clinically observing him through the line, his voice shifting into that familiar conspiratorial tone of financial excuses. "The commercial real estate market has been a little sluggish this month," he continued. "You know how cycles go. Ebb and flow. Nothing serious. Just a temporary bottleneck in cash flow. Your mother and I are dealing with a small liquidity issue. Very minor." I said nothing. I simply let the silence expand. I leaned back further, steepling my fingers together, and stared out across the vast Chicago skyline, allowing him to sit inside his own discomfort without interruption. Silence, I had learned long ago, was far more effective than argument. If you waited long enough, people always revealed what they were truly there for. "I was hoping," he finally admitted, voice tightening, "that my successful daughter might be able to help her old man out of a small jam. Just a temporary loan. $15,000. That's all." Really, just a drop in the bucket. There it was. $15,000. Not a desperate number, but a carefully chosen one. Small enough to sound reasonable, large enough to signal distress, a lie dressed up as modesty. I let the figure hang in the air between us like a weight neither of us acknowledged directly. My eyes shifted briefly to the glowing financial dossier on my monitor. The real numbers, the actual collapse behind the curtain. I already knew what he was trying to do. Preserve dignity while quietly begging for survival. Maintaining ego while reaching out for rescue. "Family helps family during difficult times," he added quickly as if rehearsed. "Chelsea, We have to stick together. I know things got a bit heated during the holiday, but we're blood. You're not still holding on to that little misunderstanding, are you? People say things when they're stressed. It's all water under the bridge. The manipulation was almost elegant in its predictability. He wasn't just asking for money. He was demanding forgiveness as part of the transaction. I sat in my quiet glass office, looking down at the city below, feeling nothing but cold, clinical detachment. The trap hadn't been set by me. He had walked into it willingly. All I had to do now was respond. I pressed the speaker again, letting the sound click sharply through the controlled silence of the room. I wanted his voice fully contained within my space, isolated like evidence under examination. Then I waited, just long enough for the tension to become unbearable. 15,000, I repeated at last, my voice flat, almost mechanical. That is an interesting number, Richard, but I have to admit, I'm confused by the logic of your request. A pause. You just spent an entire holiday evening explaining to a room full of people how useless I am. You proudly presented your son-in-law as some kind of elite financial genius who elevates your entire household. So help me understand, why exactly are you calling the defective daughter you threw out into the cold? My tone remained steady. And more importantly, why aren't you asking Donovan? Where is your brilliant, high-rolling venture capital son-in-law now that you suddenly need liquidity? The effect was immediate. The softness vanished. Completely. What are you talking about? Don't bring Donovan into this, Richard snapped, his voice rising sharply, shedding every trace of warmth. Donovan is managing complex portfolios. His capital is tied up in high-yield offshore investment structures right now. You don't just liquidate institutional assets overnight. Real investors understand liquidity cycles. I exhaled slowly, leaning back in my chair again, entirely unaffected. He wasn't speaking from knowledge. He was repeating fragments, buzzwords, half-understood phrases, borrowed confidence. And beneath it all, the truth was painfully simple. The man he was defending was just as hollow as the argument itself. When Richard's attempt to reassert financial superiority collapsed without even a flicker of response from me, he abandoned subtlety entirely. The shift was immediate, almost instinctive, like watching a man reach for the same worn-out tool he had always relied on when everything else failed. "You are my daughter," Richard barked, his voice now sharp and unstable, vibrating through the speaker with raw, unchecked anger. "Would it actually kill you to help your own parents out of a temporary bind? Is this really how you repay us? We gave you everything. You had a roof over your head, food on the table, everything you needed. And now when we ask for one simple favor, you turn on us like this?" His voice rose further, thick with indignation and rehearsed moral outrage. "So this is who you are now? An ungrateful, unfilial child? You're really going to sit there and watch your own family struggle just to satisfy your own bitter, vindictive ego?" Before I could even respond to the absurdity of his performance, a second voice cut into the line. A sharp click. A shift in audio. Then the unmistakable sound of theatrical, exaggerated sniffing. My mother. Susan had clearly been waiting just off mic, positioned on another extension, ready to enter the conversation at the exact emotional cue, like an actor stepping onto a stage. "Chelsea, please," she cried, her voice trembling with a precision that felt almost rehearsed. "Please don't do this to your father. He is under so much stress right now. The market has been absolutely cruel to him." A loud, shuddering sob followed, too controlled to be spontaneous, too clean to be real. It echoed through my office speaker with the same familiar cadence I had heard throughout my entire childhood. Engineered distress calibrated for maximum effect. And yet, I didn't react. I listened instead. Not to the emotion, but to the structure of it, the timing, the predictability. the absence of anything unplanned behind it. For 34 years, that voice had been enough. Enough to make me fold, to make me apologize, to make me surrender whatever I had just to restore peace in a system that never truly belonged to me. That voice used to override logic, instinct, and self-preservation all at once. Not anymore. "We are family, Chelsea," Susan continued, her voice rising into a desperate, trembling pitch as she escalated the performance. "We are supposed to protect each other. You can't just abandon your own flesh and blood over a silly misunderstanding at a holiday party." Another sob, sharper this time. "Brittany and Donovan have children. They can't carry this burden. You're the only one who can help us. Please, just wire the money. Have a heart. Don't be so cold. Don't do this to the woman who gave you life." I slowly placed both hands on the smooth mahogany surface of my desk. A decade ago, that combination, Richard's anger and Susan's tears, would have dismantled me completely. It would have collapsed my resolve in seconds, reduced me to a reflexive attempt to fix, to appease, to prove worth through compliance. I would have emptied accounts I couldn't afford to empty, all in exchange for a fleeting illusion of approval. But that version of me no longer existed in any meaningful way. The woman sitting in this glass office was not the same person they had exiled from their carefully curated suburban world. That girl had been trained to survive emotional storms by surrendering. This woman had been rebuilt for entirely different conditions. I dealt with financial predators now. Embezzlers, launderers, people who weaponized complexity instead of tears. Compared to them, this was not manipulation. It was routine theater. Susan's sobbing continued for a few more seconds, filling the silence like background noise in an empty room. Richard's breathing could be heard faintly beneath it, uneven and expectant. They were waiting for collapse, waiting for hesitation, waiting for the old version of me to surface and take over. They genuinely believed the performance was working. They had no idea they were speaking into silence that no longer contained vulnerability. I let it continue for exactly 15 seconds more, not out of hesitation, but calculation. Then I leaned forward, fingers hovering over the keyboard resting on my desk, and the soft clicking sound of keys entered the call like a new presence entirely, controlled, precise, unemotional. On my monitors, the financial reality of Richard's empire opened in layers: structured debt, collapsing liquidity, hidden exposure. The truth, stripped of every narrative he had ever used to disguise it. A system already in motion, a failure already priced in. Their voices were still there, still waiting. But they were no longer the center of anything. Susan's crying stopped instantly, not gradually, not naturally. It cut off as if someone had severed a wire. Silence replaced it so quickly it felt physical. Richard cleared his throat, once, sharp and defensive, but I didn't allow him space to recover. "I am not going to give you $15,000, Richard," I said calmly. Each word landed with deliberate precision. Not now. Not later. Not ever. A pause. "And before you try again, you should understand something very clearly. You are lying to me, and more importantly, you are lying to yourself." I scrolled further down. The number I was looking for was already highlighted. I leaned slightly closer to the speaker, my voice dropping into something quieter, sharper. "I know you don't need $15,000. Another pause, long enough for discomfort to settle. "I know that because I am currently looking at your actual financial position." A shift on the other end. Breathing changed, presence destabilized. "You don't need a small loan," I continued evenly. "You need exactly $142,500. Silence. "And you don't need it next week. You don't need it tomorrow. You needed it hours ago." I let the words land fully before continuing. There is a margin call against your commercial holdings at Vanguard National Bank. If that amount is not wired within the next 4 hours and 20 minutes, they will begin immediate foreclosure proceedings. Your properties will be seized, your accounts frozen, and your primary residence will be placed under lien enforcement. A faint exhale on the line. Not a response. An involuntary collapse of composure. You are not experiencing a temporary liquidity issue, Richard. I finished quietly. You are insolvent. The silence that followed was total. Not the kind of silence that comes from listening, but the kind that arrives when reality removes every possible argument before it is spoken. When Richard finally spoke, his voice was no longer controlled, no longer performative. It cracked. "How?" he whispered. "How do you know that? That's not public." "Nobody. Nobody knows that. The bank said it was confidential." A shaky breath. "How do you have those numbers?" I allowed a slow, dark, deeply satisfying smile to spread across my face as I turned my gaze back toward the vast, glittering Chicago skyline beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of my office. A sharp, intoxicating rush of total and undeniable victory coursed through me, steady and precise, like a verdict finally delivered after a long trial. Because Richard, whether he understood it or not, had always trusted institutions he never truly deserved to stand inside of. The banking industry does not trust failing, desperate men who lie about their financial assets, I said evenly into the speakerphone, my voice calm enough to feel almost detached. When Vanguard National Bank realized your commercial portfolio was built on unstable projections, falsified valuations, and toxic leverage, they did exactly what every major financial institution does when risk becomes liability. A pause. Just long enough for the weight of it to settle. They hired an independent forensic accounting firm, an elite one, to dismantle your financial reality piece by piece, audit every hidden exposure, and prepare legally binding documentation for asset seizure. My fingers rested lightly on the edge of my desk as I continued. They hired Vanguard Forensic Accounting. Another pause, shorter this time, but deliberate. They hired my company. Silence on the line thickened instantly. "I am the lead auditor," I added quietly, "responsible for executing the financial termination of your entire estate." I let the words hang there, suspended, as if gravity itself had stopped cooperating. I didn't need to rush. I already knew the impact. "You told me on New Year's Eve that I was a failure," I continued, my tone steady, almost clinical. "That I didn't belong in your world." A faint exhale escaped me, something almost like amusement. "You were right about one thing, Richard. I don't belong in your world." My eyes stayed fixed on the city below. "I own it." A brief silence followed, sharp and absolute. "Good luck finding $142,000 before 5 o'clock, I said finally, my voice cooling into something final, immovable. "You're going to need it." Then I pressed the red button on the console. The call ended instantly. The speakerphone went dead, leaving my office submerged in a silence so complete it felt almost physical, heavy, expansive, and final. Outside, Chicago continued moving as if nothing had changed. But inside, something fundamental had already ended. The fallout didn't take long. In modern suburban ecosystems, when a family narrative collapses under financial pressure and exposed truth, the reaction is rarely introspection. It is escalation. Control shifts from reality to perception, and perception shifts online. Within 48 hours of Richard's catastrophic default and the beginning of formal enforcement proceedings, my phone became something else entirely, a constant, vibrating source of digital noise. It started on a Friday evening, a cascade of notifications, then another, then another. I sat at my kitchen island with a glass of cold water, the city quiet outside, while Leo slept safely upstairs, untouched by any of it. I unlocked my screen, and there it was. Not truth, but narrative. Brittany and Susan had launched a coordinated smear campaign across social media and private suburban groups, carefully constructed, emotionally targeted, designed not to reflect reality, but to overwhelm it. My mother's post framed herself as a devastated parent, claiming I had manipulated access to their financial accounts and drained their retirement savings to sustain a lavish corporate lifestyle in the city. A story built not on evidence, but on emotional familiarity, the kind that spreads faster than fact. Brittany escalated it further. She reposted everything across neighborhood forums, parenting groups, and local community boards, amplifying it into a dense, uncontrollable echo chamber. She labeled me unstable, vindictive, dangerous, a threat to the family. But the true line they crossed wasn't financial, it was personal. She included Leo. She wrote that his neurological condition wasn't medical at all, but moral. A punishment. A consequence. A form of cosmic justice for my supposed behavior. That single detail changed everything, not because it was painful, because it was actionable. The reaction online was immediate and predictable, a flood of moral outrage. Strangers who had never met me suddenly certain they understood my life better than I did. Messages filled my inbox. Calls I didn't answer. Accusations that escalated with every repost. A distant relative called me a criminal. A former acquaintance demanded I be investigated. Someone I barely remembered suggested Child Protective Services should rescue my son from me. And yet, I did not respond. Not once. I didn't post. I didn't defend. I didn't explain. I simply documented. Screenshots, timestamps, archived posts, saved voicemails, full preservation, clean, methodical, and unemotional. Every message became evidence. Every accusation became leverage. They believed they were destroying my reputation. In reality, they were building my case file. I placed my phone down on the granite countertop and let it continue buzzing. I didn't block them. I didn't silence them. I let them continue, because escalation is always useful when it is self-directed. Then I picked up my secure work phone and made a call. It was answered on the second ring. "Good evening, Chelsea," came the calm, precise voice of Ms. Kensington. "I assume the situation has escalated exactly as anticipated." "It has," I replied. "Defamation, harassment, coordinated public targeting. They've moved aggressively, and publicly." A faint pause of approval on the other end. "How wonderfully efficient of them," she said. "They've essentially pre-built the evidentiary framework for us." "Do we proceed with cease and desist filings?" she asked. "Not yet," I said, turning toward the dark window. "Let them continue. People like this don't stop when confronted. They stop when they exhaust themselves." A pause. "Besides," I added quietly, "they still believe they're winning." There was a faint, knowing hum from Ms. Kensington. "As you wish," she said. "I'll prepare the next phase." The line went quiet. The next morning, I arrived at Vanguard Forensic Accounting before sunrise. The smear campaign was still unfolding across the suburbs like a slow-moving fire, but I had already moved past it. Emotionally, strategically, and professionally. Because by then, I wasn't looking at my family anymore. I was looking at their ecosystem. And more importantly, their vulnerabilities. I called an emergency briefing with my senior analysts at 7 a.m. sharp. The conference room glass reflected the pale morning light as I projected a single image onto the wall. Donovan, Brittany's husband, smiling, polished, perfectly curated, a fabricated identity in a tailored suit. "Verify everything," I said simply. "No assumptions, no social media interpretation." Only financial records, employment verification, and banking activity. The team dispersed immediately. It took less than an hour. In forensic work, truth doesn't hide. It just waits to be properly extracted. My lead analyst returned with a file so thick it hit my desk with a dull, decisive weight. The first page was enough. Donovan wasn't a venture capitalist. He wasn't managing funds. He wasn't directing capital anywhere. He had been terminated 8 months earlier from a mid-tier advisory firm for financial misconduct, specifically misappropriation of funds. No recovery, no redemption arc. Just removal, silence, and an NDA. Since then, no legitimate income, no verified employment, no traceable professional activity, a ghost wearing expensive fabric. I leaned back slowly in my chair, absorbing the simplicity of it. But the real question wasn't who he was pretending to be. It was how long the pretending could be financed. Because that lifestyle, the shopping, the gifts, the optics, the constant projection of success, didn't run on imagination. It ran on money that had to come from somewhere. Trace it, I said quietly. And the team did. Because in forensic accounting, money doesn't lie. It only changes direction. A handful of targeted algorithmic searches was all it took to expose the horrifyingly simple, almost poetic mechanics behind his manufactured wealth. The money hadn't come from some brilliant deal. There was no lucrative dividend, no clever investment. The hemorrhaging financial pipeline led straight, unambiguously, unmistakably, into Richard's personal retirement accounts. The digital footprint told the story of a textbook affinity scam, executed with devastating efficiency. Donovan had leveraged his position as the adored, universally respected son-in-law to systematically manipulate my father. Richard, a man of towering arrogance and staggering financial ignorance, had been the ideal target, willing, eager, and completely blind. The records showed a cascade of panicked liquidations from Richard's long-term retirement portfolios over the past 6 months. The funds had been quietly redirected under the cover of an aggressive, guaranteed return strategy in emerging cryptocurrency markets. Donovan had convinced my father he possessed insider access to a digital coin offering that would multiply their generational wealth tenfold. Those liquidated funds never touched a single exchange. They never entered any market. They were systematically funneled through a transparent shell company and deposited directly into Donovan's private accounts. The revelation was almost too clean to believe. My father had personally financed his own family's counterfeit superiority. The custom suits Donovan wore to intimidate me, bought with Richard's retirement savings. The Rolex he flaunted in our faces, purchased with Richard's liquidated assets. And the most sickeningly poetic detail, those extravagant $2,500 Christmas gifts, deployed to publicly humiliate my disabled son, had been paid for by the very man now defaulting on his commercial loans. Richard was completely bankrupt, staring down the imminent collapse of his suburban mansion and his entire real estate portfolio, because he had handed his financial lifeline directly to a charming, well-dressed parasite. His own blind prejudices had been weaponized against him the moment Donovan started feeding his ego and promising shortcuts to wealth. They had pushed out the actual financial expert, me, and rolled out the red carpet for a criminal who was quietly bleeding them dry from the inside. I closed the folder and sat with the weight of what I was holding. A profound, almost frightening sense of power moved through my hands. Brittany and Susan were out there right now, furiously typing defamatory lies about me online, fighting to protect their pristine suburban image, defending a man who had stolen their future to buy them shiny, meaningless things. They were living inside a fragile house of cards, and I was holding the only match. I picked up my phone and called Ms. Kensington. I told her to prepare a comprehensive, irrefutable evidence binder. The quiet observation phase was over. We were taking this directly into the daylight. The digital clock on my monitor ticked toward 5 p.m. I sat motionless in my leather chair, watching the live institutional trading portal linked to Vanguard National Bank. The flashing numbers reflected the brutal, unsentimental reality of corporate finance. My father had been given a strict, non-negotiable deadline: wire exactly $142,500 to cover his catastrophic margin call. I knew with mathematical certainty he didn't have it. He'd drained everything funding Donovan's fiction. The seconds dissolved. The clock struck 5. Instantly, the status indicator beside Richard's commercial loan portfolio shifted from warning yellow to terminal red. The system triggered an automatic default. He had failed. Vanguard immediately initiated foreclosure protocols, stripping away all financial protections and moving his over-leveraged debt to the distressed asset auction block. The suburban mansion my parents had worshipped above their own children was no longer a symbol of country club prestige. It was now simply a toxic asset waiting for the highest bidder. I dialed Ms. Kensington. She answered on the first ring. "The default has been triggered," I said, my voice carrying the cold clarity of the glass-walled office around me. "Vanguard has formally listed the residential collateral on the distressed asset exchange. My father is completely bankrupt. The estate is vulnerable." A low, sharp hum of professional satisfaction came through the line. "The paperwork is ready, Chelsea," she confirmed, her tone radiating precise legal efficiency. "The anonymous shell company is fully established per your parameters. Apex Holdings is funded and legally insulated from any connection to your identity or Vanguard's forensic accounting. We're ready to execute the moment you give the word." I walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out over the Chicago skyline. This was the moment the balance of power shifted. Permanently. "Execute immediately," I said. "Don't let this debt sit on the open market for a single second. Offer Vanguard a premium cash buyout for the entire loan portfolio, including the primary residential mortgage. They'll take an immediate cash injection over a drawn-out foreclosure every time." "Submitting the binding offer now," Ms. Kensington replied, the sound of precise keystrokes audible through the line. "Vanguard prioritizes quick capital recovery on bad debt. Routing this through an untraceable LLC means your parents will have no idea who actually holds their financial fate until the very last moment. Apex Holdings will read as just another faceless investment firm sweeping up distressed suburban debt. Richard and Susan would assume they were dealing with some ruthless banking conglomerate, entirely unaware that the executioner was the daughter they had thrown out into a freezing winter night. I waited in the quiet of my office while the mechanisms churned. My analysts had already confirmed no institutional buyer would move fast enough to outbid a premium cash offer submitted within minutes of the initial default listing. This had been a surgical strike. Calculated, precise, designed to leave no exit. 24 minutes later, an encrypted notification broke the silence. I opened the folder Ms. Kensington had sent and read the confirmation carefully. The transaction was complete. The wire transfer had cleared. Vanguard National Bank had legally transferred the full deed of trust and all associated debt instruments to Apex Holdings. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle into something solid. The transfer of power was legally binding and entirely irreversible. I was no longer a forensic accountant watching from a distance. I was now the primary creditor holding full legal rights to the suburban estate my parents called home. I owned the roof over their heads, the manicured lawn they used to impress people, the heavy mahogany front door they had slammed in my face 11 years ago. They had spent 3 decades treating me like an unwanted burden while maintaining their performance of generational wealth. Now their entire existence rested in my hands. They were living on borrowed time, inside a house they no longer owned, sleeping in beds that belonged to me. I picked up the phone once more. "Ms. Kensington," I said quietly, watching the sun sink below the frozen city skyline. Prepare the eviction notice. Make it legally airtight. We'll let them perform their little charade for a few more days. Then we dismantle everything. Sunday morning brunch at the Oak Ridge Country Club was a masterclass in suburban performance art. Crystal chandeliers threw warm gold across tables draped in white linen. Waiters in black vests moved through the dining room carrying silver trays of imported caviar and endless mimosas. The air was dense with expensive perfume and the hollow resonance of rehearsed laughter. A sanctuary where the wealthy gathered to display status and quietly judge anyone who fell short. At the center of it all sat my parents. Richard and Susan had reserved the premier private alcove and were hosting a lavish gathering they could not afford by any conceivable measure. They were performing the roles of their lives, masking the terror of total financial collapse behind polished smiles and bottomless champagne. Richard stood near the carving station, a plate of untouched prime rib in hand, his best navy blazer already darkening with sweat beneath the arms. I watched through a live security feed on my tablet, footage arranged by a private investigator hired specifically to document the unraveling. Richard had cornered William, a prominent elderly commercial developer who had known our family for decades. He clamped a heavy hand on the man's shoulder, projecting that familiar booming confidence he used to fill rooms and silence doubts. He leaned in close, voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, framing his desperate plea for a bridge loan as an exclusive, time-sensitive investment opportunity in a fictional commercial plaza. His teeth were perfectly white, his eyes moved like those of a cornered animal. Across the room, Susan worked the other side, kissing cheeks, complimenting dresses, carefully scanning faces for any sign that word had gotten out about the default. While my parents were fighting for their social survival, Donovan was entirely in his element. My brother-in-law glided smoothly between the linen-covered tables, projecting the image of a brilliant, untouchable venture capitalist. He wore a sharp, custom-fitted charcoal suit, paid for, in full, by the retirement funds he had systematically drained from my father. The fake gold Rolex peeked from his cuff as he gestured expansively, painting elaborate, entirely fictional pictures of massive financial returns. He had cornered a group of wealthy retired physicians near the champagne fountain, pitching a ghost project, a phantom AI startup that didn't exist in any legal or operational sense. He threw around technical buzzwords with easy confidence, convincing the older men they were getting ground-floor access to the next billion-dollar empire. He was actively hunting new victims to sustain his fraudulent lifestyle, completely unaware that my forensic team had already forwarded his full criminal history. I knew for a fact had been purchased with liquidated assets stolen directly from her father's retirement account. She paraded it around the room, blissfully ignorant that she was essentially wearing the physical manifestation of her parents' imminent homelessness. She laughed at all of Donovan's fabricated jokes, basking in the envious glances of the older country club wives. The level of cognitive dissonance required to sustain this performance was genuinely staggering. Every bite of expensive food, every sip of premium alcohol was being charged to credit lines that were hours away from being permanently frozen by federal fraud investigators. The sheer audacity of it was almost admirable in a deeply twisted way. They were drinking imported champagne and eating fresh oysters while standing on a trapdoor I had already unhinged. I sat in the back of my armored vehicle, parked 2 blocks from the club entrance, monitoring the audio and video feeds transmitted directly to my tablet. I listened to my father confidently promise a 30% return on a property he no longer legally owned. I listened to Donovan casually ask an elderly surgeon for a $50,000 minimum buy-in for a tech company without so much as a registered tax ID. They were digging themselves deeper with every syllable. The atmosphere inside was a carefully orchestrated symphony of deception. The grand piano in the corner played soft classical music, perfectly masking the frantic beating of Richard's failing composure. Susan laughed loudly at a joke from a local politician, head thrown back, projecting not a care in the world. But I could see the rigid tension in her neck. I could see her eyes moving constantly across the room, terrified that a bank representative or collections agent might walk through those oak doors at any moment. They were running on pure adrenaline and absolute denial, a fascinating study in narcissistic self-preservation. They would rather spend their last borrowed dollar staging a lavish brunch for people who quietly despised them than admit to their own daughter that they had destroyed everything. The brunch dragged into late morning. The opulence surrounding them served as a stark, mocking contrast to the reality waiting at home. Then the country club manager, sharply dressed, clipboard in hand, approached Richard near the buffet and discreetly requested a valid card for the mounting tab, noting that the primary account had declined earlier that morning. Richard's face drained instantly. The smile froze into a panicked grimace. He produced a different card, one of his last surviving high-interest lines of credit, and handed it over with a forced, dismissive laugh, blaming a banking error. The cracks were spreading. The audience of elite, judgmental peers was fully assembled and paying close attention. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I set down the tablet, signaled my driver, and pulled forward. The heavy oak doors of the Oak Ridge Country Club swung open with a muted thud. I stepped across the polished brass threshold, leaving the Chicago winter behind. The air inside carried roasted prime rib and expensive floral arrangements. I wore a tailored charcoal blazer, deliberately stripping away the vulnerable single mother image my family had always projected onto me. To my right walked Ms. Kensington, gripping a sleek leather briefcase containing the complete financial destruction of my father's existence. Behind us moved two broad-shouldered process servers in immaculate dark suits, carrying themselves with the cold, unhurried efficiency of men who delivered ruin professionally. The string quartet faded as my heels struck the marble floor in steady rhythm. We moved past the antique reception desk without slowing. The young hostess opened her mouth. One sharp look from Ms. Kensington closed it immediately. We moved through the room with the gravitational pull of absolute authority, parting the crowd of wealthy suburbanites who turned to watch. I followed the path my investigator had mapped, through the dining corridors, toward the premier private alcove at the far end of the hall. The soft clink of silverware against fine china filled the space, but my focus was entirely fixed on the table ahead. There they were, bathed in the warm glow of the crystal chandeliers. Richard, aggressively pitching phantom real estate investments to a captive audience. Donovan, grinning, showing off his fake watch while pouring champagne for prospective victims. Brittany, tossing her highlighted hair, playing the carefree, affluent wife. And Susan, scanning the room, making sure every person in the club registered their lavish, heavily leveraged display. They were completely absorbed in their delusion. None of them saw me coming. I rounded the final velvet stanchion and stepped directly into their line of sight, bringing my entourage to a synchronized halt at the edge of their white linen table. Susan spotted me first. She had a mimosa halfway to her lips when her eyes found my face. The glass tipped forward, spilling orange across the immaculate tablecloth. Her jaw dropped, the sheer panic surfacing instantly through layers of expensive foundation. The entire table went silent. Richard stopped his pitch mid-sentence, his face shifting into a mask of raw outrage. Brittany grabbed Donovan's arm. Susan scrambled to her feet so fast her chair scraped the floor with a shriek that cut across the entire dining hall. "What on earth are you doing here?" Susan hissed, voice trembling between terror and fury. She pointed a shaking finger at my chest, fighting to maintain her matriarchal authority in front of her peers. "You have absolutely no right to be in this establishment. This is a private club for respectable families. You don't even have a membership. You ungrateful little—" She didn't stop there. The panic curdled rapidly into something unhinged. She waved toward the security personnel near the buffet. Manager, she screamed, abandoning every trace of her refined country club persona. Get the manager right now. I want these people removed immediately. Call the police if you have to. I will not let this bitter, pathetic woman ruin our family gathering. Richard rose slowly, buttoning his navy blazer, puffing his chest at the process servers behind me, projecting the illusion of a man still in control. Chelsea, he said, his voice dropping low and deliberate. You have exactly 10 seconds to turn around and walk out those doors before I have you arrested for trespassing. Richard's face went crimson. I didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't offer a single word of explanation or apology. Instead, I reached slowly into my handbag. My fingers found the cold, solid edge of the card inside. I drew it out with deliberate, unhurried calm. It wasn't a standard plastic pass. It was a heavy matte black titanium card, engraved in gold lettering. I raised it and tossed it onto the center of their dining table. It landed with a sharp, definitive thud beside Richard's plate of prime rib. The general manager, who had been rushing over in response to my mother's screaming, stopped dead. He pushed past a confused waiter, looked down at the black card resting on the white linen, and went completely still. It was the exclusive VVIP shareholder credential. Not available for purchase, not accessible to the public. Reserved strictly for the board of directors and the primary financial stakeholders. The people who owned the actual land the club was built on. The color left the manager's face entirely. He straightened his jacket, turned away from my mother mid-scream, stepped around my terrified parents, and bowed deeply. Good afternoon, Miss Chelsea, he said, his voice careful and unwavering. We are profoundly honored by your visit. Please accept my sincerest apologies for the disturbance. Is there anything the staff can do to make your inspection of the property more comfortable? Richard and Susan went ghost white. The crushing reality of what they were witnessing registered across their faces in real time. The daughter they had discarded was now the highest authority in their most sacred suburban sanctuary. The manager bowed once more and quietly disappeared, leaving a suffocating vacuum of silence around the table. I didn't linger on their expressions. My primary target was sitting right beside them. I turned my gaze to Donovan. The polished venture capitalist persona he had been broadcasting all morning was visibly fracturing. He shifted in his custom suit, instinctively tugging his cuff down to cover the counterfeit watch. He attempted a casual, dismissive smile, but the muscles in his jaw were twitching. He knew what I did for a living. He knew exactly what kind of evidence a forensic accountant could assemble. I gave Ms. Kensington a slight nod. She stepped forward, unlatched the briefcase, and produced a thick, heavy red folder, placing it directly into my hands. Inside was the complete financial autopsy of the man my father had worshipped. I raised it high enough for the whole table to see, then brought it down onto the white linen with a thunderous crack that rattled every champagne flute within reach. The noise pulled the attention of every wealthy physician, politician, and business partner at the surrounding tables. Let's talk about your generational wealth, Donovan, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the dining hall. Let's discuss the investment portfolios you were pitching to these doctors just minutes ago. I pulled a bank statement from the top of the stack and dropped it onto his plate. Can you explain to your audience why an elite fund manager is currently running a negative personal liquidity ratio? Can you walk us through the phantom equity you promised my father? Or why your primary checking account has been overdrawn for 240 consecutive days? Donovan stared at the highlighted figures. A bead of cold sweat appeared at his hairline. He opened his mouth, reached for some polished financial terminology, and found nothing. His vocal cords simply failed him. You told Richard you were moving his liquidated retirement assets into a high-yield offshore cryptocurrency exchange, I continued, stepping closer, controlling the space. But forensic data routing doesn't lie, Donovan. I tracked every single cent of that transfer. The capital never reached any digital offering. It bypassed the market entirely and was wired directly into a holding account connected to an underground casino operation. You didn't invest my father's life savings. You gambled it away at high-stakes tables over a single weekend. The color drained from his face completely. His hands began to tremble visibly against the tablecloth. He looked to Richard. He looked to the investors nearby. What came out of him was a series of broken, barely coherent sounds, a man suffocating under the weight of public exposure. Brittany was on her feet before the silence could settle. She slammed both hands onto the table, face twisted with desperate, ugly fury. "You are a psychotic, jealous liar!" she shrieked, her voice cracking, shattering what remained of the room's refined atmosphere. "Donovan is a brilliant executive. You're just a bitter, lonely woman trying to destroy our marriage because you have nothing, absolutely nothing, going for yourself. He manages millions in corporate capital." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't match her energy. I simply reached back into the folder and produced a single sheet of official corporate stationery bearing the unmistakable logo of Donovan's former employer. I held it up between two fingers, letting the chandelier light fall across the text. "Corporate capital," I repeated softly, my tone carrying the quiet precision of something sharpened over a long time. "That's a fascinating description of premeditated embezzlement." I flicked my wrist. The letter landed face up in Brittany's lap. "Read it aloud," I said. "Read the termination clause from 8 months ago. Read the part where your highly successful husband was fired for cause, stripped of his security clearance, and required to sign a non-disclosure agreement to avoid a federal grand jury indictment for stealing corporate funds." I let the words land and settle before continuing. "He is not a venture capitalist. He is a disgraced, unemployed fraudster who has been putting on a suit every morning and pretending to go to a job that doesn't exist." Brittany stared down at the termination letter, eyes moving frantically across the legal text. Her breathing turned shallow. She looked at Donovan, waiting for him to snatch it away, declare it a forgery, do something. But he sat slumped in his chair, completely paralyzed by his own public execution. The reaction from the surrounding crowd was immediate and devastating. The physicians, investors, and politicians who had been leaning eagerly into Donovan's pitch moments ago physically recoiled. They murmured in low, disgusted tones, exchanging alarmed glances as the scale of what they'd nearly walked into became clear. They turned their backs. They stepped away from the table as if the entire family had become suddenly, dangerously contagious. 3 decades of meticulously cultivated social standing evaporated in under 3 minutes. Richard and Susan were no longer respected pillars of the Oak Ridge Country Club. They were a bankrupt family sheltering a documented criminal, exposed at the center of the very room they had worshipped. The silence broke with a harsh, desperate bark of laughter. Richard, watching his entire social circle physically retreat, made one final agonizing attempt to salvage what remained. He puffed out his chest, straightened his blazer with violently shaking hands, pointed a trembling, sweat-slicked finger at my face. "You are absolutely insane, Chelsea," he roared, his voice cracking under the pressure of his own collapsing reality. "Don't listen to a word this woman says. She has been unstable for years. She is a bitter, psychotic daughter manufacturing a public spectacle because we rightfully removed her from our lives. These documents are fabricated. Every single one of them." He looked around wildly, at the retreating doctors, the politicians, the investors, desperately searching for a single face that might validate him. "We are a respected family. We have impeccable credit. We are pillars of this community. This is nothing but a hysterical stunt from a woman who needs immediate psychiatric help." I didn't blink. I didn't raise my voice. I simply took one half step back, smoothed the front of my blazer, and gave Miss Kensington the floor. She moved with the quiet, inevitable grace of someone who had done this before, and felt nothing about doing it again. No raised voice, no visible emotion. She simply opened the secondary compartment of her briefcase, withdrew a thick legal envelope sealed in heavy red wax, walked directly to Richard, and pressed it firmly against his chest. When he instinctively raised his hands to catch it, she stepped back, leaving him holding it alone. "That is an emergency writ of foreclosure and a formal notice of immediate asset seizure," Ms. Kensington announced, her voice calibrated to carry across every silent corner of the dining hall. "As of 5 o'clock yesterday evening, your primary commercial loan portfolio entered terminal default status following your failure to meet a mandatory margin call of $142,500. Your primary residential estate, all associated collateral, and all frozen capital accounts have been permanently seized by your new primary creditor." Richard stared at the envelope as though it were a live explosive. His mouth opened and closed in silence. Every trace of the commanding presence he had weaponized his entire life was gone, replaced by the raw, unguarded terror of a man in freefall. He tore open the wax seal, hands shaking so badly the parchment rattled audibly in the quiet room. His eyes moved in frantic, desperate passes across the legal text, hunting for a loophole, a clerical error, any thread of hope. He read the declaration of total bankruptcy. He read the notice of immediate residential eviction. And then his eyes landed on the name of the sole acquiring entity that had purchased his toxic debt directly from Vanguard National Bank. Apex Holdings Limited Liability Company. He kept reading, found the name of the primary shareholder authorizing the takeover. His head snapped up. Every drop of blood left his face, skin going the color of wet ash. He looked at the document. Then he looked directly into my eyes. "Is it you?" Richard whispered. The voice that had dominated every room he'd ever entered, reduced now to a fragile, hollow gasp. "Are you Apex Holdings? Are you the one doing this to us?" I stood perfectly still beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Oak Ridge Country Club and let the magnitude of the moment settle over me completely. For 34 years, this man had dictated my worth. He had thrown me out into a freezing night, called my son defective, and chosen a hollow materialistic performance over his own flesh and blood. Now he stood entirely at my mercy, stripped of his fabricated wealth, his fabricated friendships, and his fabricated pride. "Yes, Richard," I said, my voice carrying across the silent room with quiet, absolute finality. "I bought your toxic debt. I own your commercial lots. I own your frozen accounts. And I own the roof over your head." I let a slow smile cross my face. It contained no warmth whatsoever. "Welcome to the world of failures." The words hit the table like a physical shockwave. Susan let out a sharp, breathless wail and collapsed into her chair, clutching her pearl necklace, hyperventilating, her carefully constructed country club image dissolving in real time. Brittany buried her face in her hands and sobbed openly as the full reality of her husband's criminal exposure and her parents' sudden destitution came crashing down at once. Donovan sat perfectly still, eyes wide and vacant, staring at nothing. A man who had just understood that his free ride was finished and federal prison was no longer hypothetical. They were surrounded by the elite society they had worshipped above everything else, and they had just been publicly, methodically dismantled in front of all of it. Not one person offered sympathy. The surrounding club members watched with cold, detached distance, quietly and permanently closing the door on Richard and Susan's place in their world. The illusion was dead. I didn't stay to watch them grieve it. I had delivered exactly what I had promised on New Year's Eve. I gave Ms. Kensington a brief, satisfied nod. We turned together and walked back through the grand dining hall. The room parted for us, Instinctively, immediately, clearing a wide path for the woman who had just executed the most precise financial reckoning these walls had ever witnessed. The heavy oak doors opened, and I stepped back into the sharp, clean Chicago air. The sky was bright and startlingly clear. I walked to my waiting car and left my family to suffocate in the ruins of the kingdom they had built for themselves. My private investigator had planted a covert audio device inside their suburban estate weeks earlier. By the time they arrived home, I was already listening from the comfort of my downtown office. The heavy mahogany front door, the same door they had slammed in my face on New Year's Eve, clicked shut behind them with grim finality. 10 seconds of silence followed. Then the illusion detonated. The air that had always carried expensive candles and arrogant certainty turned immediately toxic. They were no longer untouchable. They were cornered, desperate, and sinking. And their first instinct was to tear each other apart. Donovan moved first. The smooth, charming persona he had used to infiltrate my family vanished on the spot, replaced by the cornered criminal underneath. He ripped off his suit jacket and threw it onto the white sofa without a word of apology to the man whose life savings he had incinerated at casino tables. Then he turned, pointed a shaking finger at Brittany, and let his voice fill the vaulted ceilings. "This is your fault," Donovan roared. All refinement gone, nothing left but raw, ugly desperation. "Don't look at me like I'm the only villain here," Donovan snarled, his voice filling the vaulted ceilings. "You are the one who demanded the imported cars, the luxury vacations, the endless designer shopping sprees. You practically forced me to drain your father's accounts just to keep your delusional lifestyle afloat." Brittany backed away, eyes wide with horror, watching the man she had proudly paraded around the country club throw her directly under the bus without a moment's hesitation. "You knew exactly what my salary was," Donovan continued, advancing toward her, backing her against the marble fireplace. "You knew I lost my advisory position 8 months ago, and you absolutely refused to adjust. You threw a tantrum when I suggested flying commercial instead of chartering private jets for the holidays. You demanded those ridiculous $2,500 gifts for the kids just to prove you were better than your struggling sister. I had to secure capital somewhere to keep your greedy delusions alive. I took the retirement funds because your relentless demands left me no other choice." The victim-blaming snapped something in Brittany, her face contorted into pure, unhinged fury. She let out a piercing scream and lunged forward, her hand cutting through the air and connecting with a vicious, resounding crack across Donovan's face. The sound echoed through the empty, foreclosed mansion. Donovan didn't flinch. He simply stood there, a cold sneer twisting his features, looking down at the woman he had financially gutted with complete, chilling contempt. He had extracted everything. Now that the well was dry, he was discarding her without a second thought. Richard witnessed the entire exchange from the center of the living room, completely motionless. The booming patriarch who had thrown me into a freezing winter night stood paralyzed, his mind replaying the brutal realization that the sophisticated businessman he had elevated above his own daughter was nothing but a parasitic con artist. He had alienated the one person with the skill to protect him and handed the keys to his kingdom to a man who had stripped him of every last cent. The weight of it finally manifested physically. Richard let out a sudden, agonized gasp. His hands flew to his chest. The color drained from his face entirely, leaving a sickly, translucent gray. His knees buckled and he collapsed heavily onto the white sofa, breathing in rapid, shallow wheezes, his body responding to what his mind could no longer contain. Susan ignored him completely. She didn't rush to his side, didn't reach for the phone to call an ambulance, didn't offer a single word. Her entire existence was tethered to her social standing, and she knew that standing was currently bleeding out. She yanked her designer phone from her purse, hands shaking so badly she could barely tap the screen, and began working through her contacts. The doctors' wives, the politicians, the socialites she had been sharing caviar with just hours earlier. She paced the foyer, phone pressed hard to her ear, silently begging someone to answer. No one did. Call after call routed directly to voicemail. The network she had worshipped had already closed its doors. News of the public dismantling at the Oak Ridge Country Club had moved through their social circles with extraordinary speed. She was no longer Susan, the respected suburban matriarch. She was radioactive, a bankrupt pariah no one wanted within proximity of. She dropped the phone, slid down the wall, buried her face in her hands. The sprawling estate filled with the sounds of Brittany's hysterical sobbing, Richard's labored wheezing, and the cold, deliberate footsteps of Donovan heading upstairs to pack his bags, utterly indifferent to the wreckage he was leaving behind. They were trapped in a hell entirely of their own construction, locked inside a house that legally belonged to me. A torrential, freezing rain hammered the glass facade of Vanguard Forensic Accounting headquarters. From the warmth of my executive suite on the 40th floor, I received a brief notification from my chief of security. 2 soaking wet individuals claiming to be my parents were blocking the primary security checkpoint in the main lobby. I finished my coffee without rushing, smoothed my lapels, stepped into the private elevator and descended. The lobby was a monument to financial power. Italian marble, bulletproof glass, total silence. And pressed against the security barrier, entirely exposed to the elements bleeding in through the revolving doors, were Richard and Susan. The contrast was staggering. Richard still wore the navy blazer from the country club. It was soaked through now, hanging off his frame. His hair was plastered flat. His leather shoes were ruined. He gripped the security turnstile with both hands, shaking it, arguing loudly with my impassive armed guards. Beside him, Susan was unrecognizable. Mascara ran down her face in thick, dark streaks, mixing with the rain dripping from her chin. She clawed at the security glass, her voice cracking. "Please, you have to let us upstairs. We are her family. I am her mother. You cannot keep a mother from her daughter when everything is falling apart. Just 5 minutes. Blood is thicker than water. Please, just tell her we're here." The guards didn't move. I walked slowly across the marble floor and stopped 3 feet from the reinforced glass. I did not step through. I remained inside my fortress, looking out at the 2 figures pressed against the wall that divided our worlds. Susan saw me first. Her eyes went wide with desperate, wild hope. She slapped both palms flat against the glass. "Chelsea! Oh, thank God! Please, call off the lawyers. Stop the eviction. Your father had a panic attack. Donovan took everything and disappeared. We have nowhere to go. You cannot throw us into the street like this. Please, show us some mercy." Richard pushed forward beside her. The voice that had commanded every room he'd ever entered was gone, replaced by something fragile and hollow. "Chelsea, we made a catastrophic mistake. We trusted the wrong man. We know that now. But we are sorry. We are begging you. You have the power to fix this. You can buy the house back. You can restore the accounts. We promise everything will be different. Please." I stood perfectly still, posture straight, expression clear. I pressed the intercom button. "I am not going to fix your mistakes, Richard," I said, my voice carrying through the lobby with perfect, even clarity. "I am not reversing the eviction. I am not funding your lifestyle. You gambled your entire existence on a charming criminal because you valued prestige over loyalty. You threw me out into the cold. Now you know exactly how cold it gets." Susan sank to her knees on the wet marble floor, pressing her face against the bottom of the glass. "Chelsea, please. We will die out there. We are your family." I leaned toward the microphone. "I'm simply granting your greatest wish, Susan," I said softly, ensuring every word landed. "Do you remember what you told me on New Year's Eve? You said this house would be infinitely better off without me in it." I paused. You were right. My house is much better off without you inside it. I released the button, turned my back, walked away, heels clicking across the marble in a steady, unhurried rhythm, and returned to the elevator without looking back. The doors slid shut with a quiet, definitive thud. Back on the 40th floor, I summoned Ms. Kensington. She entered within 60 seconds, tablet in hand, immaculate as always. A stark contrast to the wreckage 2 floors below. "They're at the security perimeter," I said, weeping, begging for a financial resurrection. They believe biological ties override a legally binding commercial foreclosure. Ms. Kensington offered a thin, professional smile. "Shall I have security remove them? We can involve law enforcement if they continue causing a disturbance." "No," I said. "Having them dragged out by police gives them a narrative, the ruthless corporation brutalizing the grieving family. I won't hand them that. I want this done legally, methodically, and entirely by their own hand." I leaned back in my chair. "Go down to the lobby, act as my sole proxy. Tell them I am willing to offer a single, non-negotiable lifeline. Use those exact words. Let them assume I'm going to bail them out and restore everything. Let them cling to that tonight. Tell them to present themselves at your downtown office tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp. 1 minute late, and the offer is permanently rescinded and the eviction proceeds immediately." "Understood," Ms. Kensington said, already typing. "And the actual terms?" "No reconciliation, no forgiveness, no financial salvation," I said flatly, "pure ink on legally binding paper. We restructure their fraud debt just enough to keep them out of federal prison. I won't have a criminal trial attached to my name. In exchange, total uncontested surrender of every remaining asset they possess. Prepare the documents tonight." She turned and left without another word. Through the high-definition security feed on my monitor, I watched it unfold. The elevator opened in the lobby. Ms. Kensington stepped out, composed, precise, utterly unmoved. Richard and Susan lurched forward immediately, faces igniting with desperate, foolish hope at the sight of an executive approaching the barrier. Susan pressed her hands against the glass. "Oh, thank God. Did Chelsea send you? Is she going to wire the funds? We knew she wouldn't let her own family freeze out here." Miss Kensington stopped 2 feet from the glass. She looked at them the way one looks at something unpleasant tracked in from outside. "My client, the Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Forensic Accounting and sole owner of Apex Holdings, has no interest in your apologies," she said, her voice coming through the intercom with cold, robotic precision. "She will not see you. She will not speak with you. However, she has authorized me to extend one final, extremely limited opportunity to negotiate terms regarding your catastrophic financial default." Richard wiped the freezing rain from his eyes, shoulders sagging with relief. "Yes, absolutely. Yes," he stammered, every last fragment of his former arrogance gone. "We'll agree to whatever she wants. We just need the funds restored. Please, tell us what to do." "You will present yourselves at my private legal firm tomorrow morning at precisely 9 o'clock, Ms. Kensington said, her tone cutting cleanly through their relief. "Bring state identification and nothing else. Not your daughter. Certainly not your son-in-law. This meeting is strictly for the primary debtors on the defaulted commercial loans. If you fail to appear, or if you arrive at 1 second past 9, the county sheriff will be at your property removing your belongings to the curb. Are we clear?" Susan nodded frantically, wet hair plastered across her face. "Yes. We'll be there. Thank you. Please tell Chelsea thank you for saving us." Ms. Kensington let out a sharp, dismissive sound. She didn't bother correcting them. She simply turned her back and walked away, leaving them shivering in the freezing rain, clinging to the delusion that they had just secured a miraculous pardon. I watched through the security feed as Richard and Susan turned and walked back out into the storm, leaning on each other, falsely comforted, utterly convinced they had successfully appealed to their daughter one last time. They had no idea that the agreement waiting for them tomorrow morning was not a rescue. It was a legally binding guillotine, precision engineered to sever them from my life completely and permanently. I finished my coffee, feeling the clean, intoxicating weight of total victory. The trap was set. Tomorrow, I would close the cage. The morning sun offered no warmth as it bounced off the glass towers of downtown Chicago. Inside the top-floor conference room of Ms. Kensington's firm, the atmosphere was colder still. A vast, sterile expanse of polished steel, white leather chairs, and a frosted glass table that felt less like a meeting space and more like an interrogation chamber. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy oak doors opened. Richard, Susan, and, unexpectedly, Brittany walked in. The sight of them was a striking testament to how quickly arrogance collapses when its financial foundation disappears. They were almost unrecognizable. Richard wore a wrinkled gray sweater, his face pale and deeply lined, dark hollows beneath bloodshot eyes. Susan looked a decade older, hair flat and unstyled, hands trembling around a cheap generic handbag. Brittany was perhaps the most striking of all. No designer makeup, puffy red-rimmed eyes, and the expression of someone who had not slept in days. The reason for her collapse was no mystery. My private investigator had confirmed it hours earlier. The moment the country club exposure concluded, Donovan had returned to their rental property, packed a single bag, emptied whatever remained in Brittany's personal checking account, and fled the state, leaving his wife and children without a backward glance. She had spent years defending him loudly and publicly, and he had discarded her without a second thought. Now she stood behind her equally destroyed parents, a broken prop in a con she had never fully understood. I sat at the head of the glass table flanked by Ms. Kensington. I did not offer them seats. I did not offer water. I simply watched them shift under my gaze. Brittany couldn't hold eye contact for more than a fraction of a second. Richard placed his trembling hands flat on the cold glass and leaned forward, as though his legs could no longer carry his weight on their own. "Chelsea, please." His voice was a hoarse, rattling whisper, completely unrecognizable as the booming patriarch who had dominated my entire childhood. "We are destroyed." Donovan took the last of the emergency cash and disappeared. "The accounts are frozen. The cards are declined. We can't even buy groceries. We came because your security guard said there was an agreement. We'll sign whatever you want, just please. I'm begging you as a father. Let us keep the house. We'll rent out the rooms. We'll find work. Just don't put us on the street." Susan dropped to her knees on the office carpet, clutching the edge of the conference table, sobbing loudly, desperately recounting memories of a warm and loving childhood that had never actually existed. I looked down at her and felt nothing but clinical detachment. I opened the leather folder in front of me, withdrew a thick stack of notarized documents, and slid them across the glass until they came to rest against Richard's trembling hands. "I am going to offer you a singular legal miracle today, Richard," I said, my voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had already decided every outcome. "My forensic accounting team has spent the past 48 hours auditing your loan applications. The documents you submitted to Vanguard National Bank contained massively inflated assets and deliberately falsified revenue projections. Under federal law, that is textbook credit fraud. If I release this audit to the FBI, you and Susan will spend the better part of the next decade in a federal penitentiary." Richard gasped, hands flying to his chest. His eyes darted to Miss Kensington as though he expected agents to come through the doors at any moment. "I am permanently erasing your commercial bank debt," I continued, keeping my pace deliberate, one word at a time. Apex Holdings is absorbing the total loss of your margin call. You will not face federal indictment. You will not go to prison for fraud. You will walk out of this building today as free citizens with zero negative balance attached to your legal names. A brief, pathetic wave of relief moved across their faces. I raised one hand and it vanished immediately. However, I said, my tone dropping to absolute zero. That financial salvation comes at a mandatory, non-negotiable price. I am clearing the debt, but I am keeping the collateral. You do not get to keep the suburban mansion. You do not get to keep the luxury vehicles in that driveway. Every valuable asset, every piece of furniture, every piece of jewelry purchased using those fraudulent loans is now the exclusive legal property of my corporation. You have 48 hours to pack your basic clothing and vacate my property. You will move into a motel or a basic rental apartment, and you will learn exactly what it feels like to start from nothing. Brittany let out a sharp, devastated cry, the full reality of permanent dispossession finally landing. Richard stared at the documents in front of him, understanding with perfect clarity that he had no choice at all. He could sign away his kingdom, or he could lose his freedom. Those were the only two doors left in the room, and I owned both of them. Miss Kensington did not allow the suffocating silence blanketing the conference room to linger a moment longer than necessary. She reached into her pristine leather briefcase one final deliberate time and extracted a separate, significantly thicker stack of legal documents printed on heavy premium paper. She placed the imposing stack with surgical precision directly in the dead center of the frosted glass table. The harsh fluorescent lights overhead reflected mercilessly off the crisp white pages, illuminating the ultimate non-negotiable condition of their financial salvation, their last remaining lifeline, dangling by the thinnest possible thread. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the cool surface of the table, locking my cold, analytical gaze onto the three shattered figures sitting opposite me. I watched with quiet, clinical detachment as the last remaining shreds of their arrogant suburban pride evaporated completely into the sterile, air-conditioned atmosphere of the room. You are going to walk away from those massive fraudulent commercial loans without facing a federal grand jury indictment, I stated, my voice echoing through the room with absolute, terrifying clarity. You will not be paraded through the local evening news in handcuffs. Your names will not become cautionary headlines. But that unprecedented level of legal mercy comes attached to a permanent, unbreakable chain. What sits in front of you is a comprehensive, ironclad, no-contact, non-disclosure agreement. It is the absolute final barrier separating your physical freedom from a lengthy, miserable, and thoroughly humiliating stint inside a federal penitentiary. Richard stared blindly at the thick stack of papers, his trembling hands utterly refusing to reach out and touch them, as though the documents themselves were capable of burning him. Susan let out a pathetic, muffled sob, burying her face in both hands, completely unable to process the sheer, overwhelming magnitude of her own spectacular downfall. Brittany sat perfectly still, her eyes wide and entirely vacant, completely traumatized by the rapid, brutal, and total destruction of her entire privileged existence, the carefully curated life she had always taken for granted, now reduced to rubble in a single afternoon. I did not feel a single microscopic drop of pity for any of them. Not one. They had meticulously and enthusiastically dug their own graves across years of relentless vanity, deliberate cruelty, and boundless, insatiable greed. Now I was simply handing them the shovels to finish the job themselves. Ms. Kensington stepped forward with composed authority, tapping her silver pen against the top page of the agreement, her voice ringing out like a judge delivering a final, inescapable verdict from the bench. The terms outlined in this contract are absolute, immediate, and completely non-negotiable. the attorney commanded, her tone leaving zero room for interpretation or appeal. By signing this binding legal instrument, you are agreeing to completely and permanently erase yourselves from the existence of my client and her minor son. You are explicitly forbidden from initiating any form of contact whatsoever, be it physical, digital, written, or conducted through any third-party intermediaries. You will not call. You will not send letters. You will not attempt to approach them in any public or private setting, under any circumstances, for any reason. I took over the explanation at that point, ensuring they heard the specific, unforgiving boundaries directly from the daughter they had so callously and deliberately discarded. There is a strict, legally enforced 500-yard proximity perimeter written into that contract, I declared, watching Richard flinch visibly as the severe reality of those words fully settled over him like a cold, suffocating fog. If you ever attempt to approach me, or if you ever dare to come within 500 yards of my son Leo, my security team will not merely ask you to leave. They will immediately contact local law enforcement. You will be arrested on the spot for violating a standing protective order. And I will personally ensure that the complete federal fraud files are submitted to the appropriate authorities without a single moment of hesitation. You will completely and entirely vanish from our lives, starting the very second you walk out of this building and the doors close behind you. Brittany let out a sharp, devastated gasp, finally finding her voice amidst the wreckage of her collapsing world. But my social media, Brittany cried out, her priorities remaining sickeningly, almost impressively superficial even as her entire carefully constructed world burned to ashes around her. My followers, my friends, the neighborhood groups. How am I supposed to explain what happened without being able to tell my side of the story? You do not have a side of the story anymore, I replied, slicing cleanly through her ridiculous complaint with a tone of pure, freezing ice. Section 4 of that agreement contains a comprehensive digital gag order. You are permanently and irrevocably banned from ever mentioning my name, my son's name, or any of my corporate entities on any social media platform, public forum, or private digital communication channel. You will not post about this transaction. You will not seek sympathy from your dwindling country club acquaintances by playing the victim. You will not craft a carefully worded narrative that reframes your own deliberate crimes as someone else's fault. If a single defamatory word regarding my life, my son, or my business leaves your lips or your keyboards, a massive financial penalty will be instantly and automatically triggered. A penalty of exactly $1 million per verified violation, payable immediately and in full upon demand. The threat of $1 million penalty per incident effectively and permanently crushed whatever microscopic defiance still flickered within their broken bodies. They had absolutely zero capital, zero leverage, and zero viable alternatives. They were entirely, hopelessly, and irreversibly cornered, with no remaining exits and no remaining allies. Ms. Kensington placed 3 expensive silver pens beside the towering stack of documents and stepped back, silently and patiently, waiting for their inevitable submission. Richard reached out first. His hand shook so violently he could barely grip the smooth metal barrel of the pen. He pulled the document slowly toward him, hot tears of utter, consuming humiliation pooling in his bloodshot eyes and dropping silently onto the crisp white paper beneath them. He was signing away his sprawling mansion, his fleet of luxury vehicles, his carefully fabricated prestige, and the very daughter he had so arrogantly and callously banished out into the freezing winter night without a second thought. Susan followed suit immediately after, her weeping echoing pathetically and without dignity through the sterile conference room as she blindly scrolled her shaking signature across the dotted lines, completely surrendering her entire high society identity, the exclusive memberships, the curated image, the social standing built entirely on borrowed money and manufactured illusions. Brittany signed last. Her face was pale, drained of all color, and entirely devoid of expression, utterly and completely defeated, the performance finally over. When the final signature was applied, Richard slowly set the silver pen down onto the glass table. It landed with a heavy, hollow clink that resonated through the silent room like a gavel strike. He did not look at his wife. He did not look at his remaining golden child. He slowly raised his head instead, his hollow eyes finding mine across the table. He looked utterly emptied out, a completely hollow shell of the tyrannical patriarch he had once been, stripped of every weapon, every resource, and every illusion he had ever wielded. "I never thought you could be this cruel, Chelsea," Richard whispered, his voice cracking painfully under the crushing, suffocating weight of his absolute defeat. "I never imagined you possessed this kind of darkness inside you." I sat perfectly still, absorbing his pathetic, hypocritical accusation without feeling a single ounce of remorse or the slightest tremor of doubt. I leaned forward, placed my hands deliberately on the table, and delivered the ultimate fatal blow to his already shattered ego. "I am not being cruel, Richard," I stated, my voice radiating absolute, unshakable power without the faintest hint of anger or emotion. "I am simply doing business. The weak, the incompetent, and the fundamentally dishonest get systematically eliminated from the ecosystem. That is the harsh, immovable reality of the corporate world, the very world you proudly introduced me to. You are the one who personally taught me that precise lesson 11 years ago, on a freezing winter night, when you threw me and your disabled grandson out into the cold without a moment of hesitation or an ounce of remorse. I was simply an excellent student, and now the master class is officially and permanently over." I pushed my heavy leather chair back from the frosted glass table. The soft, deliberate scrape against the polished floor signaled the absolute, irrevocable end of the negotiation. I did not offer a parting glance to the broken figures sitting across from me. I did not wait for another desperate plea or a hollow, meaningless apology from the people who had invested years into attempting to destroy me. I simply stood, buttoned my tailored charcoal blazer with calm, unhurried hands, and walked toward the heavy oak doors of the conference room with perfect, unwavering posture. Each step measured, deliberate, and completely without doubt. Behind me, the muffled sounds of Susan weeping openly and Richard breathing in ragged, defeated intervals faded gradually and then completely into silence. Ms. Kensington remained at the table to process the signed documents with meticulous care, her sharp eyes ensuring the three of them collected their minimal belongings and vacated the premises exactly as instructed, not a second later, not a single deviation permitted. Stepping into the private elevator, I felt a physical, suffocating weight lift completely and instantaneously from my shoulders. It was a massive, toxic burden I had carried for 34 long years, a corrosive pressure to seek validation, approval, and basic human dignity from people who were fundamentally, constitutionally incapable of providing any of it. The high-speed descent to the underground parking garage felt like returning home from a lifelong, exhausting war fought on hostile terrain. I had won. Not merely a battle, but the entire war. I had fought a brutal, sustained campaign against the very people who were supposed to love me unconditionally and without reservation. I had protected my son. I had secured my financial empire, and I had permanently and surgically eradicated the disease that had quietly plagued my existence for over 3 decades. I slid behind the steering wheel of my custom black SUV. The powerful engine roared to life with a quiet, deeply satisfying hum. I navigated smoothly through the bustling, congested streets of downtown Chicago, leaving the cold, rigid financial district behind me without a backward glance, heading north toward the serene, tree-lined neighborhoods of the northern suburbs. My destination was a highly specialized elite private academy designed specifically for gifted children with unique neurodivergent profiles, a brilliantly conceived environment that celebrated sensitive, extraordinary minds, rather than attempting to force them into rigid, conventional, one-size-fits-all boxes that were never built for children like Leo. I parked near the pristine front entrance and walked through the vibrant, colorful hallways. The warm, sweet sound of children laughing freely and engaging enthusiastically in complex creative projects filled the air with an almost sacred energy. There was no screaming, no harsh judgment, and absolutely no one reducing these remarkable children to labels like defective or burdensome. I spotted Leo in the outdoor sensory garden. He was completely and joyfully absorbed in constructing an intricate, massive architectural model using magnetic building blocks, his small face glowing with pure, unadulterated concentration and joy. His teacher stood nearby, praising his incredible spatial awareness and his remarkably advanced problem-solving instincts with genuine admiration in her voice. When Leo looked up and saw me approaching across the soft, synthetic grass, his eyes lit up with a brightness that made every single battle worth fighting, every sacrifice worth making, every sleepless night worth enduring. He dropped his blocks without hesitation and sprinted across the yard, launching himself directly into my waiting arms with complete and absolute trust. I caught him, holding his small, warm body tightly against my chest. I buried my face in his hair, inhaling the sweet, familiar, irreplaceable scent of my beautiful boy. "I am right here, sweet boy," I whispered, feeling an overwhelming surge of fierce, almost overwhelming protective love rise through my entire chest. "We are completely safe now. Nobody is ever going to yell at you again. You are absolutely perfect, exactly the way you are. And I will spend every single remaining day of my life making absolutely certain you always know that, without question and without condition." The transition from that freezing, turbulent winter into a bright, magnificent spring was the most beautiful and transformative season of my entire life. I stood on the expansive cedar deck of my own private estate, holding a glass of sparkling water, gazing out over my lush, immaculately manicured backyard bathed in warm afternoon light. It was a flawless Saturday. The air carried the mouth-watering scent of grilled cedar plank salmon mingled with the rich, genuine sound of completely unfiltered laughter, the kind that cannot be performed or manufactured. This was not a stiff, pretentious gathering at a snobby country club filled with rehearsed smiles, relentless social calculation, and hollow boasts about imaginary wealth. This was a true, vibrant, deeply felt celebration of my chosen family, the family I had built deliberately, carefully, and with full intention. My top data analysts were clustered enthusiastically around the custom outdoor kitchen, debating sports statistics with passionate conviction while flipping burgers and swapping stories from their week. Ms. Kensington was relaxed in a comfortable wicker lounge chair, having completely and happily traded her terrifying courtroom suits for a flowing casual linen dress, smiling warmly as she shared a fascinating legal anecdote with my chief of security, who laughed loud enough to carry across the entire yard. Several parents from Leo's academy were chatting cheerfully near the shallow end of the sparkling swimming pool. They were compassionate, grounded people who understood intimately the unique daily challenges and the absolute, breathtaking brilliance of raising neurodivergent children. They offered one another unwavering support, genuine deep empathy, and fierce, unconditional loyalty, the currency of real community. Leo was currently sprinting at full speed across the bright green lawn with 3 of his classmates, all of them chasing a brightly colored water balloon with complete and total commitment. His laughter rang out loud, clear, and completely free across the entire yard, unburdened, uncensored, and unafraid. He was thriving. Completely and visibly thriving, surrounded entirely by adults who nurtured his brilliant, singular mind and children who accepted him exactly and wholly as he was, without reservation or condition. He was finally experiencing the pure, uncomplicated, luminous childhood he had always deserved, far removed from the toxic expectations and casual cruelties of my former relatives. I took a slow, deep breath of the warm, fresh air, feeling the gentle, healing weight of the sunlight settle onto my face like a quiet benediction. I looked around at the incredible, vibrant community I had meticulously and intentionally built around us, from nothing but courage and absolute refusal to surrender. I had spent so many agonizing years believing that blood automatically dictated loyalty, that sharing a last name somehow morally obligated me to endure endless psychological torment, public humiliation, and deliberate financial manipulation at the hands of people who viewed me as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. But standing here, watching my son smile with absolute, unburdened freedom in the golden afternoon light, I finally, completely, and irrevocably understood the profound and undeniable truth about genuine human connection. Family is not defined by biology or legal documents. Family is defined by the people who fiercely and consistently protect your peace. The people who celebrate your victories without a single ounce of jealousy darkening their eyes. The people who stand firmly and immovably beside you when the very darkest storms arrive, not because obligation compels them, but because love and genuine respect do. I raised my glass slightly, offering a quiet, private, deeply felt toast to the extraordinary and limitless future stretching out luminously before us. The long, exhausting nightmare was completely and permanently over. I had successfully and surgically severed every chain that had once bound me to a past saturated with pain, inadequacy, and manufactured shame. The empire was entirely secure, my son was entirely safe, and the ultimate lesson had been permanently and indelibly learned. When you finally find the courage to take the scalpel and cut out a deeply toxic, malignant presence from your life, the rest of your body, the rest of your entire existence, can finally, truly, and completely begin to live.